Alright, so I'm mainly making this video to focus on questions that I got asked a lot last year in live shows or on Twitter, even in Discord, and certainly whenever these situations pop up, we normally get a lot of questions asked regarding situations like this, and I'd rather get at least my opinion out there of what I do. You might listen to other people who do different things. Whatever the case is, I'd rather just get how I view these situations out of the way so you kind of already know at least my opinion, so you don't necessarily, not really waste my time, but if I'm in a live show and I'm answering kind of these things, week to week all over again, it's really taking time away from, answering kind of real questions or really analyzing each race weekend, each driver, each projection, things of that nature. And so that's mainly why I'm making this one here, to at least get my opinions out there, or at least how I view certain situations. And so the more so common questions I don't really want to answer anymore. Not really stupid questions, but I have stupid questions, or don't ask me stupid questions in my intro, and so that's how it goes. And so let's go ahead and kind of dive into this. And so the first one we need to run into, or that we always run into, is guys going in the rear, whether it's failing pre-race inspection on the day of the race, whether it's failing post-qualifying inspection, whatever the case may be. It's somebody who's moving to the rear who qualified up in the front. And this usually isn't a big deal to me, because I think it's kind of black and white, because I'm more likely to stay on people, and I don't usually get scared away, or actually, well, I'll explain it here. But it's usually black and white for me. I already have a checklist of what I look for in a guy if I'm going to keep him or remove him out of a lot of lineups. And so obviously it depends on the track type and who they are in terms of projections. And what I mean in terms of projections is, and we're not going to use any names, we're just going to use like driver A, B, and C, keep everything just like that. And so if a driver is going to go to the rear and he ends up being one of either my highest projected driver or my second highest projected driver, especially in terms of laps led and fast laps, typically that does not scare me at all. Because if all my data, if everything I'm looking at is showing play driver A, driver A is either starting on the pole or he's up front, and I fully believe that I'm seeing data or stuff to give evidence showing that he is going to be fast in this race, that he is going to have a stupid fast car. And I have him projected to most likely either win the race or finish up front, lead a lot of laps. And so say if it's a place like Las Vegas with 267 laps, at least I'm pretty sure. Yeah, see, I remember 267 right off the top of my head. So if it's one of those, and I had that guy projected to lead at least 100 laps, probably at least getting 60 to 75 fast laps, and he's going to the rear, sure, I might bump his projections down slightly to where he might go from my highest projected driver to maybe my third or fourth. But if I remove, how long it takes him to get up there, I can take away, like, okay, I had him projected for 100 laps led. I'm going to at least give him 65, 70 now. Maybe not 80 fast laps because he's not starting up front. He just loses the opportunity of clean air early in the race, but I still think he can get around 60, 65 fast laps. And so in situations like that, to where I fully believe that he's projected to be one of the fastest cars, even going to the rear, it doesn't scare me off. Not only do we have, stages in NASCAR now, we also have, not that we're going to have it a lot because we're going to practice, but some weekends we are going to have a competition caution, either due to a rain out in practice or whatever the case may be. If it rained the day before, there's a lot of variables that actually lead to whoever's starting in the back to actually get through the field pretty quickly. Say if this driver is known by the field to have the fastest car, typically the first 15 to 20 guys that he passes is not going to give him a ton of, they're not going to really race him hard. Not necessarily back markers with this next gen car. They're still going to be back markers. They shouldn't just be off pace, completely. But like, look, the Rick Ware guys are not going to give a Hendrick driver a ton of, they're not going to race him hard as he's just going through the field. And so typically when you get to, say if you're, like I said, I like using Vegas as an example because it fits here pretty nicely. Say if you're in Vegas and this guy was supposed to start on the pole, he drops to the back, and we know he's going to have a fast car, and we expect to see him back in the top 10 by at least lap 50. Is that really removing a ton of my initial projections from the guy? It took him, let's say 50, and this is on a very large number. Normally it's like closer to 25, 30 that they get back in the top 15. But even if he takes 50 laps to get back in the top 10, or whatever. How many laps is left in this race at Vegas? Around 210? 200 laps left, and he's back in the top 10. There's a chance that if he had that good of a car, that he made it through traffic that well, you know, and especially even more so if he did in a shorter time period, then he's going to get back up there and get fast laps. And he's most likely still getting fast laps going through the field, because not only do you have open air when you're the leader, you know, basically pulling away from the field, once the field gets separated and he's actually going through the field, he's going to have open air at certain intervals and at certain laps. And so we're still going to see him click off fast laps and everything. And so if the driver going to the rear is a guy that I already liked and a guy that I have already projected to do very well and have a very fast car, I'm going to stay on him. If the driver who's going to the rear is a guy starting 5th place, I had no interest in him to begin with. I saw no real reason going to him. I may have projected him for 10, 15 laps led, maybe 8 fast laps, and he's going to the rear. You know, that's the situation where I drop. But if it's specifically like the pole sitter or a guy starting inside the top 4 or 5, and I have them projected for laps led, that's when I'm going to stay on them. And so that's how I look at it. Like I didn't want to use any names, but like Kyle Larson, for example. Most of the time last year, if he went to the back, we saw him get through the field. Or even last year, if it was, can't think right now. I think it was Truex. Larson went to the rear quite a few times. Hamlin did as well. You know, when it's these good teams, when it's these good cars go to the rear, and we have them projected to do well, like, I see no real reason to hop off of them, honestly. And that's why I'm saying it goes black and white for me, because I either liked them and saw the evidence of why I liked them, and them going to the rear, you know, should not scare me off of evidence showing that they should have a top 3 fastest car or something. Vice versa, to where if it just showed that this guy is not going to be very fast, I really wasn't looking at him to begin with, you know, then that's when I don't play him. And so, at least for guys going to the rear, it just goes back to how I initially had him projected for. If I had him projected to do well to begin with, I'm most likely going to stay on them. A lot of times last year, I got a lot of messages, especially on Twitter and stuff, of like, man, do I drop this guy? Do I not drop this guy? It just goes back to, what did you have him projected to do before? Like, this should not really affect how that car does. The only time it does is at the track. Like if it's a road course, for an example, well then obviously how much of that projection is lost during the time that they're going to be in the back of the field? It's going to be quite a lot, because they don't have the amount of laps that they normally do at like an intermediate track or like at a real racetrack, you know? So like Sonoma with 90 laps, if you got somebody going to the rear and you had them projected to score 20 laps led and they go to the rear, I think you could easily knock down at least 12 of those laps. And so he's going to end up at least projected with 8 laps led. If he had any fast laps projected, then it's pretty much gone, because unlike, you know, running to intervals to where you can still get clean air at intermediate tracks, the 1.5 miles, at road courses, you're still going to be in traffic the entire time. You're not going to be able to have the fastest car. And typically the fastest car is going to be the leader at the road courses, just because he's able to do whatever he wants. And so it just depends on the driver, what they were projected to do before, and the track type that they're at. Like, so if it's obviously a race that is not having a lot of laps, then I would focus more on what is it? On Phantom. Or if it's a place like Martinsville, I'm pretty sure Hamlin was the example in my head that I was thinking of, is when he went to the rear this last in the fall race. Don't quote me on that. I'm pretty sure. Anyway, so he goes to the rear, and we had him and Truex projected to be lap leaders. Hamlin goes to the rear. We know it's going to take him probably 120, 135 laps to get through the field at Martinsville, and we're still probably going to project him to lead amount of laps. That's just when it goes to what is his projection lost in that time. Say if I had Hamlin projected to lead 140 laps at Martinsville and he was starting first, I think we can still kind of leave him in that realm. We'll get him there probably in stage 3 or something, but we just maybe knock it down to like 100 or something. But we know Hamlin's going to get through that field at least, you know, by first 200 laps of that race or whatever. And so, yeah, just base it on what you had them projected for to begin with. I don't think it's that big of an issue that other people really make it out to be. All right, and then moving on to the next one, the tracks and how I group them. So obviously we'll throw out a lot of terms like intermediate 1.5 miles. Now, granted, I dive into this a lot, but I at least want to give an idea, and I kind of like to talk about it here at the bottom. Like, obviously, when we're looking at specific data, I'll break these groups down even further, and typically the groups that I really do focus on is in terms of banking, in terms of surface types, and in terms of the load and the suspension of the vehicle, because that is really what the setups are. When you set up a car at a racetrack, all you're doing is setting up a car to carry as much speed to the corners and carry as much speed entering the longest straightaway of the racetrack. And so when we start looking at all these intermediate tracks, and I mean, most of the time I refer to all these in 1.5 miles just because I don't really like the term intermediate. I think that categorizes way too many racetracks into a wrong category, but that's just me. So anyway, like when we're looking at Charlotte and Dover, there is way more in common between how those cars react to the G-forces being given to them than they do, say, compared to Charlotte and Homestead or Auto Club in Las Vegas. So, you know, that's where these more specific groups come from. But typically, when I'm looking at data as a whole, I'm looking at Charlotte, I'm looking at Dover, Darlington, Homestead, Auto Club, Las Vegas, Kansas, Texas, Nashville, Michigan, and Pocono all together because they all race the exact same. Or, I'm using that loosely, but they all race close enough to where you can pull data from each one and understand. Why do I leave Pocono in there? Because Pocono is basically, if you're killer at 1.5 miles, if you have great speed at 1.5 miles, you're most likely going to carry that into Pocono. Michigan's a super speedway. Auto Club's a super speedway. They're 2-mile racetracks. What are they doing comparing them? What are you doing comparing them to Charlotte? Well, they race just like intermediate. They race just like 1.5 miles. Oddly enough, I know they're 2 miles, but you still drive them very similar to how you do a 1.5 mile. It's just on a bigger system, you know. You still enter the corners the same way. You still get on the brakes the same way. You still set the cars up for the same way. And so typically, like, you can use Michigan data when looking at Texas. You can use, you know, Auto Club data when looking at Darlington, when looking at Charlotte, things of that nature. When you're looking at Nashville super speedway, despite it's like a 1.33 mile racetrack, it's a short track, but it races just like an intermediate. It races just like a 1.5 mile. And so typically these are the groups that I categorize, you know, the tracks that are how I look at it. And then when we get to Phoenix, Richmond, Martinsville, Gateway, New Hampshire, all these race the exact same way. And you can pull a lot of data from them. Obviously, you know, Martinsville is going to race vastly different from Phoenix, but it's still an area that you could pull data from and, you know, at least reliably understand where teams are going here. I think, for example, this year, I think you're going to see a lot of carryover data come from Gateway when you go to New Hampshire, when you go to Richmond. I think you're going to see a lot of data from Worldwide actually might end up racing more similar to an intermediate track, which I don't think so. It's more too flat. Anyway, that's how I group them. Obviously, road courses are all grouped together. You guys already know this. I don't like breaking up the road courses in terms of rovals or real road courses. That's just not me. I don't really like, taking the time to do that. Daytona, Talladega are obviously together to super speedways. Really, data is just irrelevant there. Bristol is left out here because obviously Bristol Dirt's just a joke. Regular Bristol, I would honestly probably put more into the first group up here. I would say that I say this like I don't know what I do each year. Typically Bristol, if I am going to be looking at data, I'll typically see how the cars are performing at more of the high banks, and which is why I think that more people probably need to categorize tracks specifically at high bank than low bank, because the amount of stress that you put on the vehicle at Bristol is very similar to what you put at Dover, is very similar to what you put out at Charlotte. You know, it's more of just how the suspensions work at these certain types of tracks. And so that's kind of how I look at it. Don't just, you know, broadly look at all 1.5 miles the same and then say that you can't take anything away from Pocono. And like, if you look at a lot of the data, a lot of it does correlate. And I have Charlotte here because Charlotte is my favorite 1.5 mile to look at. specifically the Coca-Cola 600. However you do in that race, how your car performs, and I could look at it in different data sets, whether I'm looking at it during the day, at night. The Coca-Cola 600 is the end-all be-all for me. That is typically where I end up having people squared away for the entire year in terms of how they performed at that one race. That's just why that's first there, because I think Charlotte is a huge tell of what happens. If you're looking at intermediates in terms of which ones race more similar, I would honestly say that Las Vegas, Kansas, Darlington would actually race similar to each other versus Charlotte. Oddly enough, that's when we kind of get into, breaking groups down even further and stuff. But anyway, this is basically how I break them down. Just want to put that out there as well. So I'm kind of not, where are these groups? Okay, I was afraid I cut this off. They don't fit with any group. Okay, cool. I didn't cut anything off. I was just talking. All right, when we talk about underfunded teams and sponsorships, when we talk about starting parks, we don't really have those anymore, but we still have teams that are going to be slow. And specifically this year, I don't think we're going to have a lot, because Xfinity should have a gigantic car count for Daytona. They should have a gigantic car count this year, which is a shame because we're back at 36 cars in Xfinity, which I wish we'd open it back up to 40. I think it's even 32 again in trucks, which is kind of BS because we're probably going to have at least probably 43 cars or 43 trucks capable of show up each and every week this year. And I think for Daytona this year at Xfinity, we're probably looking at like 52 something cars at Xfinity for Daytona this year. And I think that's very representative of how many people would actually race this year. And so it's a shame that we cut the field down. But anyway, that's why I'm kind of talking on this, because I don't think this is going to be as big of an issue as it used to be. Maybe at the very bottom of the point standings, or when it gets late in the year and it's guys that are just swinging for the fences and qualifying to try and make the race. But usually whenever new money comes in and new sponsorships come in. So say, for example, Mike Harmon gets a sponsorship on a Thursday, which I think this is a really good example, because he got fined a shitload of money this year during the offseason for running his cars at Rockingham. I think it was $150,000, which is a lot for him, a lot for that team. Anyway, so say Mike Harmon announces a sponsorship on Thursday. They are with so-and-so Heating and Electric. They're gonna, paint the car. They're gonna put new wrap on the car, yada, yada, yada. And they're hyping this car up to race on Saturday, blah, blah, blah. Well, okay, that's good they got more money, but typically the way money works in racing is if you get the money, you don't see the immediate effects of that money up until you buy new equipment, which even if you buy new equipment the week of, or when you first get that money, it's still going to take a week, 2, 3 weeks, maybe even 4 weeks to implement that in a race car and the race team. And so just be aware that, new sponsors the week of, or new money the week of, does not necessarily mean that exact car that they're racing that weekend is representing that new money or that newfound money. And really, same thing as like the deals and teams that get sponsors at the racetrack the day of or the weekend of, like those trucks, the team has already left the shop with those race cars in the trailer on Wednesday evening or Wednesday midday. So any sponsor added on Thursday, Friday to that car is just cosmetics, is just added to the outside of that car. All that equipment was still prepared earlier that week. All that equipment was still prepared early in advance. Like, that car is not necessarily getting that money, invested. And so we might not even see that money invested in a new car, like I said, for 3-4 weeks down the lane or down the road for whatever reason. And so you got to remember that, because I got a lot of stuff last year for like starting park cars or teams that, had sponsors, that had really good sponsors, late in the week. And I would be like, look, that car that they're running is not going to have any of that money really thrown into it yet. It's still the old equipment. And so, just also keep that in mind. Also, I do want to add that, like, a lot of these starting park guys, they have not starting park, but a lot of these underfunded teams have way more passion for racing than anybody else in the sport. So if we could just stop shitting on these poor backmarkers, because I know for a fact I'd be a backmarker if I was racing any of these series. And moving into basically the last thing I want to talk about goes from the sponsorships to punts is like, is it punt week? What are my requirements for punts? And so basically, usually with my optimizer, it's usually going to throw in punt lineups for me anyway, just because that's how I project stuff for. But in terms of realistic chances for a punt lineup to work, we need to look at the track type. We need to look at how many laps is in the race, and we need to look at what that allows your lineup to do. And so like track type, for example. So typically, short tracks, punts typically seem to come up a lot more because there's more laps in the race. There's more possible lap leaders. There's more possible guys who can get fast laps and laps led. And the more of those guys you have in your lineup, the more of those guys you have in a lineup, the higher chance you have of having an optimal lineup, a lineup that scores very well, a lineup that is going to cash. And so short tracks, typically when punts are most, let's say, guaranteed to work, but without entirely crazy stuff happening, short tracks usually make it happen. When we get to rec fests, obviously not counting super speedways here, when we get to legit rec fests, like Texas, the fall Texas race this last year, when Wallace got spun out of turn 2, collected quite a few guys. We had BJ McLeod, we had David Starr, we had a couple other Rick Ware guys who started in the back, avoided the wreck, were able to pass, 5, 6, 7 guys. And that's typically when the punt lineups, will be optimal or at least have a chance of working. So I want to get those two out of the way because those are typically the most realistic situations for them to work. I typically punt because it allows me to do a lot with my lineup. And so if I like having, a lineup with like 4 potential dominators or 4 guys who I think can at least get fast laps and lead laps throughout the entire race, that's what I'm going to play it. I know it leads more into, and it's more so in this next, this next slide I want to talk about. All right, which let me show you this next slide because it kind of goes back into kind of what are my punts for, or what are my requirements for punts going into each and every week. And so basically just goes into laps led and fast laps and how many drivers to chase them down with. And punts and arguing and debating how many dominators you should have in each lineup, I believe, go hand in hand. I just want to say that more possible lap leaders, like let's talk about we'll just keep using Las Vegas because I think it's a very good example. If I think a Las Vegas race is going to have 2 to 3 lap leaders in that race, and I want to just have all 3 of those guys in there, I might take 3 or even 4 shots of trying to nail the 3 lap leaders in that race. And so typically the more, shots you take, the more drivers you use in a lineup to try and nail the lap leader, the higher chance you have of getting a lap leader. So typically that leans safer, but it's not optimal. An optimal lineup doesn't necessarily mean you got to be safe. Optimal means like you hit every single guy that you needed to. You hit every single thing right. And so that's where you kind of got to make a stand. Do you want to be, lean safer in terms of, jamming in a ton of dominators, or do you want to be optimal? Because if you're being optimal, you need to make sure that you hit the guys that you need. If I think driver A and driver B are the 2 lap leaders, then I need to make sure driver A and driver B are the 2 lap leaders, because if those are the only 2 guys I play in a lineup, then I need to be sure that I'm laying on the right guys. Whereas if I play driver A, driver B, and driver D, and let's throw driver E in there as well. So I'm not playing driver C, and driver A ends up being a bust. He does not lead any laps. He finishes around 6th. However, driver E, not necessarily as highly owned, but he's up there. He leads some laps. Driver D leads some laps. Driver B leads some laps for me. And so I might have 1 bust, but 3 guys kind of make it up for it to where I wouldn't lean that way if I went with 2 drivers. Long story short, I would just much rather have more arrows to fire at the target. That's just kind of where it goes. And so it goes back to, is this punt week? What are you doing? And it goes to like, what is it allowed to do with your lineup? I probably need to move this. You probably can't even see it. Basically just says, or I see this as a situation where I need to punt. I'm punting in weeks where I think I can nail a ton of lap leaders. And it might even not necessarily be a race where there's just a ton of laps to be given out. Like Las Vegas, 267 laps might be a bit overkill to aim for a 3 to 4 dominator type of lineup, but sometimes I like to do that. When we get to Martinsville or the short tracks, for an example, that's why I say punts typically allow short Punts typically go through at short tracks easier because there's so many laps led. Going back to that same example I gave out of focusing on driver A and B, instead of focusing on driver A, B, D, and E, at Martinsville, it's much more likely we're going to see at least 3 lap leaders and possibly even 4 lap leaders. And so I want to try and get those in there. The only way I'm going to get those in there is if I punt, in the low 4,000s. Lastly, I do want to talk about is who I actually use for my punts. If I'm punting, then typically I'm going to use all the salary. Because not only are like true, I'm not talking about 5K punts. I'm talking about like 45, 46, 47, 48. Those are the 4 salaries that I will punt with. And typically I do not like spinning up at 48 and 47. I want to punt at 46,000 and 4,500, or 4,600 and 4,500. If I'm doing that, I understand that I'm most likely using all my salary. I'm not trying to get different there. The punts are not going to be highly owned. I'm not too concerned about duplicated lineups there. And if I'm punting, I'm embracing using all my salary, because if I'm punting, I need the salary relief somewhere to fit in, my 3 to 4 dominators in a lineup. And so basically, requirements for punting. It needs to be a track type that I think is going to lean towards it, or a race that I think is going to lean towards it. So either a short track or a race where I see a lot of lap leaders and a lot of different guys possibly getting fast laps in this race. It allows me to do a lot with my lineup in the sense of getting a lot of those guys in there. It allows me to, spin a lot of arrows at the target. And it allows me to use all the salary because that's what I need to do. And the punt has to be starting near the back for me. I know that's not written on there, but I typically want my punt driver, my punt play, to be starting as far back as possible. If I can get him starting last, that's going to be great. If I can get him starting second to last, third to last, fourth to last, most likely where I want to go. If I start playing a punt, say if the field is 37 cars, if I'm playing a punt that's starting 30th, I'm concerned that he's going to fall back to 33rd, give me not a whole lot of points. I want a guy who's starting near dead last, who is dirt cheap, 45, 46, 47, 48, and who can possibly gain some positions, either through attrition or, miraculously just gain a couple positions. Lastly on that, if I'm punting, it's because I see that there's not a huge amount of difference between drivers who are in the $4,000 range and in the $5,000 range. If somebody is $4,500 and I have them projected to score anywhere from 8 points to 12 points, and I have a lot of the more expensive 4K or the 5K drivers projected to score 11, 12, 13, 14, well, there is not that much difference between my driver at $4,500 who could score, 8 to 12 points, and a guy who's $5,400 who might score, 12 to 15 points. There's not enough difference there to justify, playing a 5K guy or playing a high 4K guy. I would just stick to the low $4,500 guy or the low $4,600 guy. And so those are more my requirements for punts. And typically these just click off like whenever I'm in a live show and somebody asks me, do I want to punt this guy? I just look, I see where they're starting. I see what their price is. I look at my projection form and I answer that with the yes or no really quickly. And so anyway, I want to just put that out there. I want to get these out there so I don't necessarily have to keep answering these this year. Hopefully at least gives you an insight to how I look at some of these things. And we'll start talking about Xfinity and trucks coming up. Stupidly enough, I don't like how they wait till, like mid-January, late January to start announcing things. Like, are you guys that disorganized? Do you guys just not have these deals done? Like, come on, we're less than a month away from the season actually starting. And so, trucks, Xfinity, and I'll probably start looking through some lap-by-lap data from last year. More so talking about situations that drivers were put in, not necessarily like what this car is going to do, because obviously last year was a different car for some of the different series. But anyway, just want to put that out there. Want to make this, and yeah, thanks for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one.